event, sponsored by the Center for Art, Museum, and Cultural Heritage Law, and co-sponsored by CIPLIT, the Center for Intellectual Property Law and Information Technology. And I want to thank Professor Barbara Bressler and Vadim Shifrin and Ellen Gutiantov, who worked with both of our centers in helping to put this program together. And I want to welcome, I know many of you are DePaul students and DePaul alums, but I also see people from the Field Museum, and I see some people from the University of Chicago, and there may be people from elsewhere that I don't recognize, but I want to welcome you all to DePaul as well. But most importantly, I want to welcome our speaker, Cori Wegener, who is the Associate Curator in the Department of Decorative Arts, Textiles, and Sculpture at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, where she works with the American and European decorative arts collections. She's also a retired U.S. Army Reserve Major with 21 years of service. Wegener completed several military deployments as a civil affairs officer, including assisting the Iraq National Museum after the looting of 2003. As a result of that experience, she founded the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, a nonprofit dedicated to U.S. implementation of the 1954 Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. In 2010, Wegener helped create the Smithsonian Haiti Cultural Recovery Project and continues to serve as the International Project Coordinator. She serves on the International Council of Museums Disaster Relief Task Force and on the boards of the Association of National Committees of the Blue Shield, the U.S. Committee of the International Council of Museums, and the U.S. Military Civil Affairs Association. Wegener received her bachelor's degree from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and holds MA degrees in political science and art history from the University of Kansas. Finally, before she begins to speak, and I will call her up here, I want to ask you all to turn off your cell phones, not only because if they ring that will be disturbing, but more importantly because they interfere with the microphone and they cause static and feedback and whatever. So with that, it really is a great pleasure for me to have Cori here with us in Chicago to talk about her work. So.
Thanks very much, Peggy. Can we have the lights down just a little so it'll be easier to see the slides? And I'm going to try to stand off to the side just a little bit. So we're going to do kind of a speed tour today of what it was like in working with the Iraq Museum after the looting in 2003, but then also the incredible developments that occurred afterward that I think have actually taken a tragic circumstance and turned it around a little bit to where we have a lot of hope for what can actually be done to mitigate and even prevent damage to cultural property during armed conflict. So I'm going to start with just a little short history lesson about a reminder about cultural property and the devastation and looting that occurred during World War II, both intentional and unintentional. So as you know, Hitler and Hermann Goering and the Nazis were self-styled art collectors. Some of them were actual art collectors, and were responsible for a lot of intentional looting of cultural property all over Europe, plans to loot cultural property in other countries, as well as all sides were guilty of unintentional damage to cultural property during the armed conflict. There were a small number of allied forces called the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives teams that were part of the U.S. military called the Civil Affairs Division, and they had counterparts in other allied national militaries such as the British, and a few others, but notably most of the monuments people were British and Americans. And so they worked not only to mitigate damage during battles, so here you see Frederick Hart, the famed Italian Renaissance art historian working in Italy. You see here Edith Standen from the Metropolitan Museum of New York, the textiles curator, along with Rose Valland, who is famous for helping to save art that was looted from museums in France from the Nazis. And just a note on that, she and James Rohrer, whom you see here with his pipe on the stairs of Neuschwanstein Castle, recovering some of those paintings that were looted from France, notably are featured in several books, but most notably the most recent one, The Monuments Men by Robert Edsel, which to my great joy was recently picked up, which will become a movie starring George Clooney, starring George Clooney and written by George Clooney. So I'm really excited about that newfound notoriety for the World War II Monuments Men, and let's hope he does a little bit better job explaining civil affairs than he did for the Three Kings movie, which was about the first Gulf War. And so here you see some of these monuments men at work, and there was a lot of work done behind the scenes here in the United States by the scholarly community and by museums such as the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. to put together these teams of monuments, fine arts, and archives personnel. Altogether, there were fewer than 100 of them working during the war, and they worked to not only prevent damage, but also to deal with the caches of cultural property that the Nazis left throughout Europe. And so here you see some of those caches. And this was kind of seen as a little bit of a good news story coming out of World War II. Many things were lost, but a lot of things that could have been lost were saved and subsequently restituted to their rightful owners. Though we're still dealing with these issues today, and that's a whole other lecture and a whole other course probably on the fate of cultural property after World War II and how museum professionals and parties who are still looking for cultural property that was taken from their families and from their communities, we're still working to find those rightful owners today and find out more information about collections that have been missing. So that's just a really brief history of cultural property in World War II in 2 minutes or less. And that led to an important international convention, the 1954 Hague Convention, for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, which we'll just call the Hague Convention today. So this is in a nutshell, not a legal briefing today, but in a nutshell, we agreed to respect each other's cultural property during an armed conflict and to refrain from using it for a military purpose. So we don't want to use the White House to store weapons or use the National Gallery as a staging area for military troops, etc. And we also prohibit theft or vandalism of cultural property by our militaries during an armed conflict. And that fast forwards to 2003 and the invasion of Iraq and the subsequent looting in the very early phases after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Sadly, I don't have any images, those images of the bases running in and out of the trunk of a car, etc., that a lot of us saw back in 2003. But this image of a young man carrying a sink with gold-plated faucets out of one of Saddam's palaces is pretty indicative of what was going on in Baghdad right around the beginning of April 2003. And as a lot of you know from the news reports of the time, and now that this is getting on to be many years ago, some of you might not remember so well because you could have been in grade school or junior high and weren't really paying that much attention to CNN, but this was the result, that estimates are about 15,000 things were looted from the museum. But what you didn't hear much about were monuments, fine arts, and archives teams rushing to the rescue. And that's because these days we really don't have very many people dedicated to this task, even in civil affairs. And what you see there is the grand total of the Arts, Monuments, and Archives team in Iraq. And this is my friend Wes Sumner, who's still in the military today, but he had an anthropology background and an archaeology background. So he was there on the ground when I arrived in May of 2003, about a month after the looting had occurred. They decided to send somebody with some museum expertise to try and help the museum get back up on its feet. So there you go, May 2003. This is the museum grounds, the National Museum. A lot of people have read things about the original National Museum, which was built after World War I. This is the subsequent museum and sort of outside of actual downtown Baghdad, but just not too far from what we were often referred to as the Green Zone in Baghdad and one of Saddam's major palaces there. So this was about 10 minutes from where most of the troops were staying when I arrived, but it was also right on the route that the Thunder runs to take Baghdad and the initial invasion of U.S. forces happened. When I arrived, I began working immediately with the staff at the museum, including Dr. Donnie George, who was there, who many of you might know of, Lamia Al-Gailani, as well as civilian governmental people from several other countries, people from the Ministry of Culture from the UK were there, people from the Italian Ministry of Culture. You see Ambassador Bondioli Osio in the background here at the museum. We're having an event. So I also worked with the then director and the head of the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage. So it was all about trying to get to know the staff, convince them that I was there, not just in my capacity as a civil affairs officer, but also in my capacity in my civilian job as a museum curator there to help them stabilize their collection and try to get as much of it as they could back and work with them on the infrastructure of the museum, which was very much suffering even before the U.S. invasion. So here you see kind of the looting entry points where a lot of the looters came in. And the initial news report said 170,000 objects in the collection are all gone, the entire collection's gone, etc. And the truth, as you found out later, if you read sort of back in the 10th or 12th page of the newspaper, the retractions saying no, not the entire collection actually wasn't taken. It was hidden in a secret storage location, but many of the things were taken from the galleries, so now we think there's only 45 things, and it was really hard to get the story straight back then. And in part that's thanks to the magnificent staff at the Iraq Museum who took the time in the lead up to the invasion to hide their collections with, they knew that trouble was coming and they wanted to protect their collections as best they could. There are many similar stories about museums during World War II hiding collections and evacuating them from the premises. So that's what they did, and the only things they left on view were things that couldn't be relocated. And so these smashed cases, even though it looks ominous, didn't have any objects actually in them when the looters arrived, and a lot of times they just were smashed out of frustration. But some really important things were taken, the famous work ahead, the famous vase of Worka. Any of you who've studied Intro to Archaeology or even Art History 101 are familiar with some of these objects. The sculpture of King Entemena, one of the earliest known sculptures of a king that actually, and the inscription says, this is the king, right on it. The Nimrud ivory is very famous. Some of them were damaged by water damage even before the war down in storage, but some of them had been preserved and were stolen. Cylinder seals, about 4,000 cylinder seals were taken. And here's another example of how the staff tried to prepare the museum for war. They sandbagged the floors in this Assyrian gallery in case the friezes along the walls and the sculptures fell. But unfortunately, the looters, when they weren't able to take away things like the statue that was basically cemented and screwed down to the floor, to the marble flooring, they just broke it. Same with this lion from Tal Harmal, which I noticed is in all the posters advertising the talk today. It's one of my favorite objects because of the poignancy of the fact that its partner was undamaged and has this little foam cape on to try and protect him from the kind of terrible things that were going to happen. And it didn't protect many of these objects. So we basically tried to work with the military police and JIASIC, the Joint Interagency Cooperation Group, which was doing sort of the investigation on the looting and who was responsible for the looting, etc. And I was there in my capacity as a museum professional to try to help the staff. And here you see some of the military police who are working with their local Iraqi police, bringing things back to the museum. And things started to be recovered a little bit later in the summer. We got reports and tips from the locals. People brought things back under a no questions asked policy. Here you see some of these really important objects being returned gradually throughout the summer, to include the famous work ahead. You see there, this is one of my nervous moments where everybody in the room feels like they want to be seen on camera holding this object all at once. Not good museum practice. But many things are still missing. So altogether, about 15,000 objects were looted from the museum. They've gotten roughly half of those things back. And this is one of the important things to note about preparing collections and cultural property against the dangers of armed conflict is this museum did not have a full inventory of their collection before the war, so it's really, really hard to know what's missing when you go back into storage or back into the galleries, coupled with the fact that this was the flagship museum for Iraq, and so everything that had been excavated in sites around the country, more than 12,000 archaeological sites that are documented, were often brought to the National Museum to be cataloged. And during the sanctions that existed even prior to, between the two Gulf Wars, they didn't really have the staffing at the levels that they needed to do that cataloging. So many things were excavated, brought to the museum, and never cataloged. So that's another compounding factor. Documentation is one of the most important things that people, I know you're not all museum professionals, I'm used to lecturing at museum professionals about protecting collections, but it's something that we don't even accomplish as much as we should at museums here in the United States. So when these things are seized at customs points, etc., around the world, it's sometimes hard to document whether they were part of the Iraq Museum collection or not, unless they have the number written right on them, but these numbers are written on there so that they are removable, so that's another problem. One of the most famous restitutions happened when this statue of King Entemena was recovered in New York, and through a sort of sting operation, and ultimately it was returned to the Embassy of Iraq and returned to Iraq. But it's a little bit scary when you think about how the black market works and how this sculpture made its way all the way from being looted from the Iraq Museum to a sort of underworld warehouse in New York City. And another compounding problem, I feel like I'm glossing over these horrific problems to get to the kind of point of how this changed things later, but archaeological sites all over the country suffered from looting. Those of you who have an archaeology background know that this is not how you excavate an archaeological site. And here you see my colleague John Russell is flying in a helicopter over this site at Issen, and the looters are just waving. So we were able to do a lot of projects to work with the museum to try to get it restabilized. We had grants from all over the world and from the US Department of State. We had commanders, military commanders funding to help renovate the museum and buy new generators and all this sort of thing. And it helped a lot. It improved the security around the museum. You can see here the fence is twice as high as it used to be, and now there's lovely razor wire all around the top as well. There's a wonderful conservation training program going on up in the Kurdistan region where students from all over Iraq are provided with training on conservation of collections, collections management, things like that. And this is just my favorite picture because this kind of represents some relationships that were developed at that time that were ongoing and led me to talk to other people who knew other people who knew other people that are the reason I'm here today. So it's my colleague, John Russell on the left, who's an archaeologist. And he's at the Massachusetts College of Art, and that's Donnie George on the right. This is my last day in Iraq, and I was sure I was never going to see these two guys again. And luckily, I was wrong, and it led to many other things. But first we had to go through the negatives, and that was images like this where, every time I see this image at lectures and films, it's, oh, the US fired on the Iraq Museum, etc. And you don't hear the whole story of how there were snipers with rocket-propelled grenades up on top of this building shooting down at US forces. They did shoot a tank round through it, they killed the guy, and they kept driving, and they ceased to shoot at the museum. But this was a real PR nightmare. In addition to the looting of the Iraq Museum, images like that. Images like this, no commander wants to see US-led forces leave a trail of destruction. You want to be the good guys, right? You want to be seen as helping. You want to be seen as, liberators, etc. This is not the kind of negative PR you need, and this is not why you go to war. It's to get a bad reputation about how you deal with the cultural property in the country you're going to. But people need to be educated, and at the time, the US was not a states party to the 1954 Hague Convention. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't have paid more attention to this, but there were guidelines in place. There were vague statements like, we adhere to those portions of the Hague Convention that are considered customary international law, etc., which seems very vague. It's a lot different than, if you violate the Hague Convention, you'll be violating the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That's a whole different level of violating. And negative PR in the academic community, this was seen as such a tragedy. And in the archaeological community, in the museum community, there were many publications that brought about public awareness for this problem beyond just the headlines. I mean, this is over the course of years, lots of publications. And even 5 years later, my least favorite, which is me on the cover of the Museum's Journal in the UK, implying that I'm trigger happy and shooting up the galleries in the Iraq National Museum with my armed guards there. So this is just an example of how this story gets out of hand. But the benefit of this is you can take this back to the military and say, how'd you like that? You didn't like that very much, did you? Now let us help you change it so that you don't get caught up in that again. And that's how we started the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield. As you might imagine, I got very frustrated on my many nights over 9 months, sitting on my bunk in my room in Baghdad thinking, you know, I could be home right now having a latte if only we hadn't had all these issues with cultural property here, or else I actually probably would have been in Afghanistan instead. But the point being that I kept trying to think about how things could have gone differently. What if we had had briefings about the importance of these cultural sites? What if? And a lot of my international colleagues implied to me that it might be nice if the US actually did ratify the 1954 Hague Convention, which we never had, and that if we had an organization that's mission was to raise awareness about these issues, especially within our military, and to actually come over and do an emergency response. And that was one of the problems, is that actually there was really no emergency response for cultural heritage in Iraq. There really aren't organizations like Doctors Without Borders that come over and help culture. And you know, some people argue that that's a good thing, that we need to focus on the humanitarian, but my argument is that culture is part of the humanitarian and has been ignored for too long. So how come we did this so well in World War II and we don't seem to be able to focus on it now? And I think it's a matter of re-educating people about it. So we established the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, and it's a pretty basic mission to protect cultural property worldwide during an armed conflict. And then it's part of an international group, but each national committee has their own partners. And so this is just a kind of a long list of our partner organizations here in the United States that helped us start the organization and become internationally recognized by the International Blue Shield in Paris. So I'm going to talk about a few of our programs that kind of came about and how awareness raising, it didn't just come from the Blue Shield, obviously, but overall, and how we're involved in these different activities that have really raised awareness since 2003. And I'll start with the ratification of the Hague Convention. And to me, this is one of the most important benefits that came out of the tragedy of the looting of the Iraq Museum, because the U.S., with our experience in World War II and having had the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives teams, the majority of personnel were American personnel then, we helped to draft the 1954 Hague Convention in The Hague after World War II, and we signed that convention, but unfortunately never ratified it. In 1999, it was transmitted finally to the Senate for consideration, but then it languished there, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee never took up any kind of discussions about the Hague Convention. The sort of lobbying for that took place over a number of years, and the first Senate Foreign Relations Committee actual hearing on it happened in April 2008. the ratification happened, thank goodness, just before the worst of the financial crisis. I remember that there were multiple bank failures, and now it's the very next morning after, and I was thinking that how lucky it was that we got it through when we did. And on March 13th, 2009, we submitted our instrument of ratification to UNESCO to become states parties to the Hague Convention. And I should just mention, we're only states parties to the main 1954 Hague Convention, not to the first or second protocols, and I don't have enough time to tell you why. But we're gonna work on that. And I don't always have a slide of my host when I do a talk, but I think that it's worth noting, and I say everywhere I go, that few people had more to do with the U.S. becoming a states party to the Hague Convention than Peggy Berselblit. And she was the one who really drove the whole process, held my hand and drug me around and talked to the right people about my experience, and has really supported the Blue Shield from day one. So thanks, Patty. So the second program is promoting military planning and training in accordance with the Hague Convention. And now that we've actually ratified the convention, it's a little bit easier to go to military commanders and argue why they need to do this. They used to say, tell me where it says I have to do this, and now I can say right here in the Hague Convention. So in the Hague Convention, there's an article that talks about these military measures, and it says that you have to, during peacetime, add into your regulations and instructions things that ensure that the Hague Convention will be fostered and respected, and that you foster a spirit of respect for the culture and cultural properties of all peoples. Well, that's been kind of going on even since 2001 with Afghanistan, as the U.S. military recognized pretty quickly that they were sending soldiers into an environment that they didn't, into a culture that they didn't understand. And they started doing cultural awareness training very early on. Things like how to meet and greet people, how to show respect in this culture that you're suddenly surrounded by, etc. How to deal with women, how to deal with children, religious issues, what to do if you're invited into someone's home, these kinds of things. But cultural property didn't really have a whole big part in that. And now we're trying to change that by, in 2004 when I got home, one of the biggest things in my after action report about my 9 months experience in Iraq was that there's no quick and dirty guide for military personnel on how to handle issues of cultural property. There's no do remove the painting from the puddle of water, but don't use a blow dryer to dry it, things like that. And literally, civil affairs units were asked to do things like rescue collections of paintings from storage in the basement of the Ministry of Culture building that had been flooded when looters broke the pipes to steal the toilets, things like that, very basic stuff. But here you have a whole series of buildings requiring an emergency response for cultural heritage where, you know, there are many museums here in the United States that have never rehearsed their emergency plan for their collections. And I can pretty much guarantee that the Iraqis had actually done more of that than we had because of the multiple armed conflicts that they've been in. But they still, you know, did not have the people to respond to this. And meanwhile, everything's going crazy around them. They're worried about their families, and many of these collections just kind of got abandoned. So was my argument that, you know, we have a quick and dirty guide, graphic training aid, GTA, for everything, practically, like from how to tie your boots to how to do maintenance on your M16 to how to wear your running vest the correct way, things like that. Why can't we at least have one first aid guide for cultural heritage? And so amazingly, this is actually the second edition. It was published within about a year, which is amazingly fast for the military, and it's in its third edition now, which I don't have a PDF of. But so the most recent one was published in 2009. Now I'm a little bit worried that they're going to stop publishing it because of all the budget cuts, but at least we did have it out there. Another big success in 2008, the new Stability Operations Manual came out. This recognized that the stabilization of a place where you go to have a war is just as important as the war itself. In other words, this is not normal. past military doctrine, and it recognized the need for a manual on this that covers all these scenarios. And so, okay, it's not in the front, it's in chapter 5, paragraph 52, but it does address shrines and art, and it talks about unless there's a military necessity, which is explicitly talked about in the Hague Convention, what that means, the force has to protect, preserve all historical, cultural monuments and works, religious shrines, objects of art, and any other national collections of artifacts or art. So this is huge. It's telling them a proactive thing that they do have to do. So something that people like me, when I was there, could have pointed to and say, sir, it says it right here, chapter 5, paragraph 52, blah, blah. This is what military commanders like to hear. And then it also says that you have to have in your plans people within your armed forces who are specialists in cultural property, whose purpose is to secure respect for cultural property and to work with the civilian authorities. So basically what I was doing there, this says, again, this is part of the Hague Convention, not Stability Operations Manual, but it says in the Hague Convention that you have to do this. And this was written really looking back to World War II, because remember this is 1954, and they're saying, hey, those monuments teams did some pretty good stuff, and they actually managed to save a lot of things. Let's make sure that we write that into the Hague Convention, saying that countries have to try and establish one of these kinds of forces. Well, unfortunately, not very many military, national militaries have been able to maintain this, and especially in the US. We have an all-volunteer military, and these days not very many people who are art historians or museum curators, maybe a few more archaeologists, are not joining the military, raising their right hand and taking the oath. But in other militaries, it does seem to be a bit more common where they take people who have this specialization and they promote them at a certain level, say lieutenant colonel, and they put them in the reserves. This is something that we're working toward, providing direct commissions for people with cultural property experience and degrees to be able to come into civil affairs and do this kind of work. So that's a huge improvement, whereas before, oh, if we happen to have a museum curator lying around, we're going to send her, but they didn't actively try to recruit people with these skills. Now they are trying to do that again. And we're also providing training. So we talked about there's this planning and trying to recruit people into the military who have these skills, but what the Blue Shield has been doing is using our connections with the military to approach commanders, and especially in civil affairs, because that's where these types of units are situated, is within the civil affairs, just like they were in World War II. Civil affairs deals with, when you go into a country, working with the civilian authorities there to maintain stability and keep things up like the garbage disposal and clean water and medical care and cultural property. So here we are doing some training at Camp Atterbury, Indiana. My partner here is Fred Hebert from National Geographic, and he's an expert on Afghan cultural heritage and archaeology. And we're training a group of soldiers and Navy personnel who are preparing to go to Afghanistan to serve on provincial reconstruction teams there. And a lot of them will run into situations where the local authorities want to do something with their local museum, etc. So these guys will have a little bit of background when they go. Here's Dr. Brian Rose. He's with the Archaeological Institute of America, and he also teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's here with a group of really happy, I must say, civil affairs soldiers, and he's giving them a tour of the collections at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology. Here, another one of our partners is the American Institute for the Conservation of Artistic and Historic Works. This is Dr. Barbara Roberts, who is a conservator, and she's giving them a basic class, like half an hour, on the different kinds of materials that can be found in collections: paper, leather, ceramic, glass, metalwork, and what are the environmental conditions that they should be stored under if you have to transport things in a really expedient manner, as we say in the military, how to do it and cause the least damage, etc. Here's one we did very recently at the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, and this is a team of civil affairs soldiers who are now in the Horn of Africa working on a mission with AFRICOM there, and they're getting a briefing from the curator of the collections there on East African art. And then we also, the past several years, have done the program with the National Defense University's International Fellows. These are colonels and one-star generals from about 55 different countries who are invited by the U.S. Secretary of Defense to attend the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And they go on a national tour around the United States to learn more about what America is really like. And one of their stops has been Minneapolis over the past several years. And they come in and they get a quick class, in fact, kind of similar class to what we just had about the Hague Convention. Many of them, their countries are states parties to the Hague Convention, and they haven't really heard too much about it themselves. So we talk about the importance of culture, and I give them what I hope is a really interesting tour of our arms and armor collection, which I curate. It's probably one of the things that they are most interested in seeing. And we talk about the Hague Convention and why it's a good idea and what are the parameters and things like that. We have discussion. And it's been a really successful program thus far, and I hope they keep coming back. So, and then just a little bit about our, what we're calling the No Strike List program, for want of a better terminology, but this is an effort by mostly non-governmental organizations to include the Blue Shield. And when I say Blue Shield, I don't just mean here in the US, I mean the whole international network. So we have Blue Shield national committees in about 25 different countries, and then several more that are under construction, as we say. They haven't yet been recognized officially as Blue Shield national committees. And then we have the International Blue Shield, which is made up of 5 international cultural heritage organizations that are kind of UN-sponsored organizations. So the International Council of Museums, International Federation of Libraries and Archives, International Council, Library Associations, International Council on Archives. There's one called CCAAA, which is about audiovisual archives, and then ICOMOS, which some of you might be familiar with, the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And we have a network of connections whereby when a country looks like it's going to be in danger, and increasingly, even when a country's not in danger, we're starting to gather this information about cultural sites in that country. So the Hague Convention says, recommends that we all put together a list of our own domestic cultural important sites and send it to the UN to be put on file there. Well, most countries don't actually do that. So what happens when you have a situation where there's just been a UN resolution where the UN asks NATO to do a no-fly zone in Libya, and you have the largest archaeological site in the world, Leptis Magna, right there in Libya, and among hundreds and thousands of other significant cultural sites? Who tells the US military, oh, don't forget, Libya has some really important cultural sites? Well, we took it upon ourselves to tell them, and I have to give Patty another pat on the back because she's actually the one who called me and said, you know, it looks like the UN's actually going to do this resolution. Do we have this information available? Well, we didn't, and we quickly set about working with our international networks to put it together, along with the Archaeological Institute of America and many academics here in the US. And we put together a list and got it to them about 24 hours before the first NATO bomb runs in Libya. And it was, we got it to the Department of Defense, it was loaded into their computer system and shared with our NATO counterparts. And the result was that there wasn't a whole lot of damage to beautiful sites like this one at Leptis Magna. And then not long after, a couple of months after, our Blue Shield president of the, it's a bit confusing, but he's the president of the Association of the different national committees, Karl Habsburg, who's from Blue Shield Austria, went to Libya along with another gentleman, Joris Kila, who is a Dutch military cultural property officer, and they went along with Hafid Walda, who is a Libyan archaeologist, and they traveled to all these different sites to get a sense of what kind of damage resulted from the NATO bombing. And luckily, interviewed many, many people and learned that the damage was very minimal. So that's really important. And we're hoping to build on that success going forward anytime where the U.S. is involved in military action, but also this stands to reason when other countries are involved. How do we provide that information? You can't abide by the rules of the Hague Convention if you don't know where the cultural property is that you're supposed to avoid damaging. So this is a kind of an important part of what we can contribute to the overall ensuring that Hague is implemented properly. And then finally, emergency response for natural disasters. This is not part of the Hague Convention, but when the International Blue Shield was founded back in 1996, they realized that the same networks you would use to get information about armed conflicts are true when you're talking about natural disasters. So just briefly, the Haiti Cultural Recovery Project happened after the 2010 earthquake, and those of us working in these issues, it was a sort of a panicky situation because the devastation was so huge. And I knew that one of the big responders would be the U.S. military and wanted to ensure that they had as much information as possible. And I realized that cultural property and organizations from the U.S. might be able to help out because we're so close. It's only an hour flight from Florida. So we had a big meeting with the Smithsonian Institution and the American Association of Museums and many other of our supporting member organizations. And we ended up doing what's called the Haiti Cultural Recovery Project. And it's the first time that in a US government funded aid package for humanitarian assistance in a natural disaster like this, they set aside a tiny percentage of that total funding for cultural heritage. We got $2 million out of the however many $1 billion in the aid package, but we were able to do a lot with that money. And here you see us working with the UN security forces there to try and rescue some cultural heritage out of the Centre d'Art, one of the most important art centers there in Haiti. We brought volunteer conservators over from the American Institute for Conservation. They rotated in and out on a every 2 weeks basis. Here you see one of the Smithsonian conservators training Haitians to do this kind of basic recovery work. And we were able to, this is like a huge project too in a nutshell, but we were able to save the Holy Trinity Cathedral murals, which you see clear back here in the beginning, completely devastated. Only 3 of the 12 murals survived the earthquake, and they've all been completely deinstalled from the walls and safely stored for when they rebuild the cathedral. So that's just kind of in a nutshell, the kind of thing that I think cultural heritage professionals, if they work together in networks, can achieve. And some of the successes that we have had over the past several years, and which for me all began with the terrible news of the looting of the Iraq Museum and the small part that I could play in that. But all the people I met and all the sort of networks that were put in place from that, I think led us to where we are today. And it's not perfect, and we have a lot more work to do, like ratifying the first and second protocols to the Hague Convention. But I think we're miles ahead of where we were 10 years ago, and I'm hoping for young people and emerging professionals to really make a difference in all this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Willing to take a few? Yeah, sure. Okay. So I think, is there a microphone to pass around?
We don't need to use it.
Don't need it. Okay. Any questions? Yes?
Regarding, Baghdad and the looters, who were they? Was there a primary group? Was it political? Was it just a moment of opportunity? Did they fit a general profile?
Well, all of the above. There's been whole books sort of with chapters about this by, like, for instance, Colonel Matthew O'Donnell wrote kind of his report on the looting of the Iraq Museum. But really it was, for some of the looters, it was a crime of opportunity. They saw other people running out of the building with stuff, and this museum hadn't really been open to the public in more than 10 years on a on a regular basis, in fact. And so a lot of people kind of saw that as Saddam's stuff, and they were taking the opportunity to get some of Saddam's stuff. I also think that there was a certain criminal element that does this kind of thing for a living, who paid attention to the fact that they thought there was going to be a U.S. invasion and planned to take advantage of any instability that occurred. So there's some evidence of inside information of the looting of the museum. I'm not saying people who were staff there, but people who had been staff there, the guy who might have come to fix the air conditioning unit at some point in time, they knew where things were within the building, where to find keys, where hidden doorways were, etc. So I think there were different levels of looting, and I think in the end there were also some people who literally did take things to protect them, and they meant it, and they brought them back very early on in the game. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of your work, and I think it's really important. But I wonder if you would speak a little bit to the conflict between international law and national politics. Meaning, it seems to me that there's kind of dynamic going on here where your group and others that are working on cultural assets are trying to promote a kind of international awareness of this, and yet a consistent trend across, unfortunately, all administrations in the United States in the last 30 years, I would say, to de-emphasize culture and to undermine culture as merely an elitist, something or other that doesn't need to be taken care of. So obviously the planning for the war, which did not include any cultural assets, seemed to be kind of indicative of this. But as I say, it seems to me it's not getting any better. It's getting worse. So how working on an international level of protecting cultural assets, do we address the national problem, or is that merely kind of irreconcilable?
Well, I think one of the things that the International Committee of the Blue Shield really recognizes is that each country is going to have its own unique problems and situations. And from an international perspective, one of the U.S.'s big problems that people just can't believe is that we don't have a Department of Culture at the presidential level. And we're one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have a ministry or Department of Culture. So I do think that that sends a message, both here at home and abroad, that we don't care about culture. That Americans see culture as movies, and that's our big export: movies, music, etc. And this is a problem that we deal with. How to change that? I'm a museum curator. I wish people cared more about culture and came to the museum all the time instead of staying home to watch the Super Bowl. But that's I don't know how to solve that. But we're fighting really hard to raise awareness of this issue, and I think maybe among the general public we haven't done that much good as far as that goes. But amongst the military, I think we are making progress, and I don't think it's getting worse. And I think that they do recognize their responsibilities under international law, and just that it helps them do their mission. I mean, that's kind of a basic thing. You can tell people why something's good for them all day long, or why they should think about doing something, but when you explain to them the benefits that are real tangible benefits to how they can do their job better, increase stability, and then go home, they like that. They like that a lot. So I don't know if I really answered your question. I think it was a very good statement of the situation right now, and I agree with you that it is hard to get attention for culture, especially in an environment of decreasing resources right now. Everybody's worried about budgets and slashing of budgets, etc. And it is tough to make the argument.
Thanks, Cori. That was really interesting. I have a question about you're actively recruiting people in the military with cultural property skills. How's that going?
Well, how is it going actively recruiting people with cultural skills? It's not going as well as I would hope, because I think that they've put too stringent of restrictions on it. But there's a couple of issues here. The military is a culture unto itself, and I think it's really good for me to remind people in academia and in the museum world, whenever I see them, that yes, culture is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but don't forget that the military has its own unique culture as well. And amongst those things in the US is that we have an extremely professional military, through which it's a lot like academia. You got to pay your dues. you go through and do, and only then do they even talk about maybe you get tenure and et cetera, et cetera. Well, the military is a lot the same way. So arguing that somebody should become an overnight captain or lieutenant colonel because they know a lot about foo-foo culture stuff doesn't go over super well in the military culture. And I, in fact, even though I was a 20-plus year military veteran who came up through the ranks, I was enlisted, thank you very much, back in the day. I used to crawl around and run telephone wire in the mud. But I had to prove myself because of the job I was there to do. I constantly had to say, no, I went to basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and stuff like that. Oh, we thought they maybe just put a uniform on you and sent you, and that's why you're here. So it's tough making that argument. We do this for doctors, lawyers, and now some cultural property professionals, like accountants from time to time, people with those skills. And so what they've done is, I think it reads something like, you have to have a master's degree and at least 5 years of experience, et cetera, et cetera. Well, by then you've got a museum career or an academic career, and what are the chances that you're really going to join the military, like literally, and they want you to go through the same officer training programs and everything. It's not just a 2-week learn how to salute and shoot a pistol type of course. So I hope that they relax some of those requirements for people who are already in the military system. But they've also made it so that if you're an NCO, a non-commissioned officer, you can't apply. They want only outside people, and I think that's crazy. So I'm lobbying hard to change some of those requirements, but I think it's much more effective if we look for people who are already in the military system and, in my opinion, doing the wrong kinds of jobs, like being a combat engineer or shooting in the infantry or something. When if you've got an archaeology degree, I'd much rather see you go over to civil affairs. So.
Time for one.
Is there a difference that you've seen in attitude between the military leadership and the troops, and that maybe the troops are more receptive to this kind of training and protecting cultural property, or? Well,
the question was, is there a perceived difference in the way the troops accept the idea that this is important training versus the leadership? Keep in mind that for my part, I've only trained civil affairs units, and I think that they are kind of equally accepting. And one of the advantages I have, but that it's also not necessarily a good thing, is that I know a lot of people because of how old I am, and when I retired from the military, all my buddies are now becoming colonels and one-star generals. And so the good news is I know a lot of these guys, and I can talk them into letting me come and do training that's not necessarily required training for them to mobilize their units. But they call me, or I see them at a conference or when I'm in DC, and they say, yeah, come on over when we're at Fort Bragg or whatever. And so, but the downside of that is, what happens when I'm gone? What happens when these guys retire? And we're gradually building awareness, but it needs to become a requirement. And that's also what we're working for. And I think the mid-level leadership gets it, and we're working to get this into more of the institutionalized at places like the War College and Commander General Staff College, and places for the whole force, not just for civil affairs. They need the extra training because they're supposed to be providing these experts that they don't have, but the whole force also needs more training on this, I think. Well, I think that's all we have time for, because some of you have to get to class, but thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you, Cori, as well, very much. I think that was a whole another side, or another way of looking at some of these issues than what we're accustomed to doing here. So again, I want to thank you very much.